Chapter 30 of Finn the Wolfhound by Alec John Dawson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30 The Exodus. It was rather an odd thing, this fact that neither Finn or his mate ever again entered the lair which had been such a happy home for them since the day of their first meeting. But so it was, and one is bound to assume, I think, that the reason for it was grief for the loss of their children. In the early dawning of a blistering hot day they paced slowly down the hill and into the rocky strip of scrub which divided Mount Desolation from the bush itself. Hereabouts it was that the rest of the pack lived, and though Finn and Warrigal conveyed no definite news of what had happened during the night, the news must have spread somehow, because before the sun had properly risen every single member of the pack had climbed the spur and investigated for himself or herself the scattered carrion which had been Tasman. Whether they looked into the den or not as well I do not know, but I should say that some of the adventurous youngsters did, while their elders and parents probably refrained. These same elders and parents were beginning to feel considerable distress over the absence of rain, the scarcity of water, and the poor results which attended their hunting. The wild folk of the Australian bush are, upon the whole, less dependent upon water than the animals of most countries, and such people as Koala, the native bear, seem to get along quite happily without ever drinking anything at all. Even kangaroos and wallabies can go for a long while without drinking, but there is a limit to the endurance of most of the bush animals in the matter of thirst, while, as for the dingoes, they want their water every day as much as they need their food. There was no longer any disguising the fact that a very large number of the wild folk in whom Finn and Warrigal and the rest of the pack were interested had recently migrated in quest of homes that should be better equipped with water than the Tynagh or the Mount Desolation range. It was not that the pack felt the absence of these folk as companions, but as food. They were also beginning to feel keenly the burnt-up dryness of that whole countryside and the extreme heat of the season. Even Finn's prowess as a hunter and a killer was of no avail in the absence of game to hunt, and during the few days which he and Warrigal spent among the scrub at the mountain's foot after leaving their den, the Wolfhound sometimes travelled from 30 to 40 miles without a single kill, being reduced then, like the rest of the pack, to eat rabbit flesh and mice and grubs. Already some of the younger members of the pack had begun to prey upon the flocks of squatters in the Tynagh, and this had brought speedy retribution in the shape of one young female of their kindred shot through the head, and 2 promising males trapped and slain, so that the pack now consisted of no more than 14 adults and 6 whelps, who were hardly capable as yet of fending for themselves. Men with guns had actually been seen within a mile of Mount Desolation itself, and owing to the attacks upon their bark of half-starved small fry, the trees of the bush were dying by hundreds, and thereby opening up in the most uncomfortable manner ranges which had previously been excellent hunting grounds. The report about the menfolk with guns was most disturbing to Finn, and he was conscious, in sitting down, of a degree of boniness about his haunches such as he had never known since the horrible period of his captivity in the circus. A wolfhound whose fighting weight is 150 pounds requires a good deal more food than a dingo, whose weight rarely exceeds half that amount. Grubs and mice were not of much use to Finn, and when he drank, his long tongue had been wont to scoop up more than twice the amount of water which had served to satisfy any other member of the pack. The growing restlessness and discontent which had been mastering the Mount Desolation pack for weeks now received an immense addition, so far as Finn and Warrigal were concerned, in the events which led them to forsake their den on the first spur. It culminated, in Finn's eyes, in the actual passage through the scrub beside the mountain's foot of a party of half a dozen mounted men with guns and dogs. This occurred in the late afternoon of a scorching hot day, when most of the pack were sleeping, and if the dogs of the menfolk had not been incredibly stupid in the matter of sticking closely to the trail and making no attempt to range the scrub on either side of it, the dingoes would actually have been hunted like hares, and some of them, no doubt, would have been killed. As it was, Finn felt as strongly, and perhaps more strongly than any of the elders of the pack, that this event had rendered the range finally uninhabitable. His nostrils twitched and wrinkled for hours after the men had gone, and as soon as darkness fell he rose in a determined manner, thrust his muzzle meaningly against Warrigal's neck, and took to the open trail. With extraordinary unanimity the other members of the pack began to gather behind Finn. It seemed to be clearly understood that this was no ordinary hunting expedition, and the two mothers of the pack, with their half-grown whelps, whined plaintively as they gathered their small families about them for journeying. The whelps, always eager for a new move of any kind, gambolled joyously around their parents, but the mothers snarled at them, bidding them go soberly, lest weariness and worse should overtake them before their time. One very old dog, who had always looked with grudging sullenness upon the great Wolfhound and his doings, refused point-blank to be a party to the exodus, and croakingly warned the others against following a newcomer and an outlier such as Finn. He gave them to understand that he had been born in the shadow of Mount Desolation, like his sire and dam before him, and that he would live alone rather than forsake that range at the bidding of a great grey foreigner. The pack paid little heed to the old dingo, and he sat erect on his haunches beside the trail, watching them file along the flank of the mountain. When they were nearly a mile away the old dingo began to howl dismally, and when Finn made his first kill, 7 miles to the northwest of Mount Desolation, old Tufter, he had a sort of mop at the end of a rather scraggy tail, was on hand and yowling eagerly for scraps. The kill was a half-starved, brush-tailed wallaby, and nobody got much out of it but Warrigal and Finn, both of whom growled fiercely while they ate, in a manner which said plainly that they were not entertaining that night, at all events before the edge had been taken off their own appetites. So old Tufter got nothing more nutritious than a few scraps of scrubby fur. The poor old fellow took great pains to communicate his own discomfort and mistrust to all the other members of the pack, except Finn and Warrigal, whom he ignored, and pointed out with vehemence that they were heading in the wrong direction. He was right in a way, for they certainly were leaving the better country behind them in travelling to the northwest. South and east of Mount Desolation lay the fatter and comparatively well-watered lands. Even Finn knew this, of course, but that way also lay the habitations of men, and the Wolfhound's face was set firmly away from men and all their works. Men had tortured him in a cage, the memory of which their hot irons had burned right into his very soul. And after that, men, in the person of a certain sulky boundary rider, had driven him out from their neighbourhood with burning faggots, with curses and with execrations. All this had been brought vaguely to Finn's mind by the passage through the scrub that day of horses and men, and the northwest trail was the only possible trail for him because of that. From this point on the pack moved slowly in scattered formation, each individual member hunting as he went along, with nose to earth and eyes a-glitter for possible prey of any kind, from a grub to an old man kangaroo. Towards morning, when they were a good 30 miles distant from Mount Desolation, they topped a ridge upon the farther slope of which a small mob of 9 kangaroos were browsing among the scrub. Finn was after them like a shot, and Warrigal was at his heels, the rest of the pack streaming behind in a ragged line, the tail of which was formed by old Tufter and the whelps. There was a stiff chase of between 3 and 4 miles, and only 5 dingoes were within sight when Finn pinned the rearmost kangaroo by the neck, and Warrigal darted in cautiously upon one of its flanks. In an attack of this kind, 2 things about Finn made his onslaught most deadly: his great weight and the length and power of his massive jaws. Even Tufter got a good meal from this kill, For the kangaroo was a big fellow of well over 5 feet from nose to haunch, without mention of his huge muscular tail, the meaty root of which kept the whelps busy for hours afterwards. The whole pack fed full, and in the neighbourhood of that range they scattered and slept; for in the gully on the other side of it there was a little muddy water, and round about there was pleasant cover which had sheltered the kangaroos for a week or more. Old Tufter forbore to growl, and the young members of the pack were enthusiastic regarding the advantages of migration in the trail of such a hunter as Finn. They did not know that, in a leisurely way, the mob of kangaroos they had flushed were also migrating as the result of drought, but in the opposite direction to that chosen by Finn, who was heading now towards the part of the country which the kangaroos had forsaken as being burned and eaten bare, and devoid even of such food as bark. When the dingoes had finished with the little chain of small pools in the gully on the afternoon of that day, there was little left but mud. One might have called it a creek bed, but it certainly was no longer a creek. However, that night's travel brought fairly good hunting, and always among game moving in the opposite direction to that taken by the pack. Finn and Warrigal and Blacktip shared a wallaby between them, and spared some portions of it for the whelps, though Warrigal snarled angrily when the young ones came near her, the memory of her own family being still fresh within her. And the rest of the pack fared quite tolerably well, sharing between them a kangaroo rat, 2 bandicoots, a wallaby hare, and quite a considerable number of marsupial mice, besides about half of a big carpet snake which Finn killed. For a week now the little pack travelled on in a northwesterly direction, and every day old Tufter growled a little more bitterly and with a little better cause. Game was certainly becoming lamentably scarce, and the country traversed was one which did not at all commend itself to dingoes, being arid, shadeless, and dry as a bleached bone. It was the sort of country which in Australia is frequently covered by beautiful flowers and scrub during the winter, though perfectly bare in the summer. But the winter which had preceded this summer had been too dry to bring any growth there, so that it had not even the remains of a previous season's vegetation, and offered no trace of cover. A long and most exhausting chase did enable Finn to pull down a solitary emu, and of this the pack left nothing but beak and feathers when they passed on, still hungry, in quest of other game. But for all the shortness of food, which was thinning the flesh over Finn's haunches now, it was another cause which led him to swerve from the northwesterly course in a southwesterly direction. He paid no particular heed to old Tufter's continuous growls about the direction taken by the pack under his leadership, but what he was forced to notice was the fact that for 2 whole days no water had been seen, and the lolling tongues of the young whelps were in consequence so swollen that they could not close their jaws. Throughout one weary night the pack loped along in a dogged silence in a southwesterly direction, their eyes blazing in the keen lookout for game. Dry, dust-encrusted foam caked upon their lips, and fierce anxiety in the heart of every one of them. Then, in the brazen dawning of a day in which the sun seemed to thrust out great heat upon the baked earth even before it appeared above the horizon, the pack checked suddenly as Blacktip drew Finn's attention to a pair of native companions seen in the act of floating down to earth from the lower limbs of a shriveled red gum tree. The bigger of these 2 great cranes had a stature of something over 5 feet, and his fine blue-grey plumage covered an amount of flesh which would have made a meal for quite a number of dingoes. Yet it was not so much as food, but rather as a guide and indication that Blacktip regarded the cranes. He knew that they would not be very far from water. The way in which the pack melted into cover in the dim, misty light of the coming day was very remarkable. For several miles now they had been travelling through a country less arid than the plains they had traversed during the previous 2 days, and now, while seeming to disappear into the earth itself, even as echidna actually could and would, though the earth were baked hard, the members of the pack actually found cover by slinking low among a sort of wiry scrub growth with which the ground hereabouts was dotted. It was thus that Finn saw for the first time the strange dance of the native companion. To and fro and up and down beneath their scraggy gum tree, the two great cranes footed it in a sort of grotesque minuet. There was a strange sort of angularity about all their movements, but withal a certain grace, bizarre and notable. And while the native companions solemnly paced through what was really a dance of death for them, Finn and Blacktip and Warrigal stalked them as imperceptibly as shadows lengthen across a lawn in evening time. The three hunters moved through the scrub-like snakes moving in their sleep, and never a leaf or twig made comment on their passage as they slithered down the morning breeze, inch by inch, apparently a part of the shadowy earth itself. The prancing dance of the native companions, these birds mate for life and are deeply and devotedly attached one to another, was drawing to its close, when death came to them both like a bolt from the heavens, such a death as one would have chosen for them, since it left no time for fear or mourning or grief at separation. Their necks were torn in sunder before they realized that they had been attacked, and within the minute their graceful feathered bodies shared the same fate as the rest of the pack joined Finn and Warrigal and Blacktip. There was less of lordly generosity about Finn's feeding upon this occasion than he had always shown before. The great Wolfhound realized, perhaps, that his frame demanded more of nutriment than was necessary for the support of a dingo, and he ate with savage swiftness, growling angrily when any other muzzle than Warrigal's approached his own too nearly. Less than half an hour later the pack was scrambling and sliding down the high banks of a river bed, in the centre of which, surrounded upon both sides by a quarter of a mile and more of shingle and hard-baked mud, there was still a disconnected chain of small yellow pools of water. The water was of something like the consistency of pea soup, but no spring-fed mountain rill ever tasted sweeter or more grateful to a thirsty traveller than this muddy fluid to the palates of the Mount Desolation pack. Finn chose a good-sized pool, and Warrigal tackled it with him, but when two youngsters of the pack ventured to approach the other side of that pool, Warrigal snarled at them so fiercely, backed by a low, gurgling growl from Finn, that the two slunk off and tackled a lesser pool by themselves. Where the pack drank they rested. As yet their great thirst was close to them, and the neighbourhood of water seemed too good to leave. But in such matters the memory of the wild folk is apt to be short. The banks of the river bed ran due east and west here, and though the pack gave no thought to the question, it was a matter of some importance to each one of them whether they should eventually leave those banks to the northward or to the southward, a matter of importance by reason of the difference in the country to the northward and to the southward. But it was chance at last that decided the question for them. They drank many times during the day, and towards nightfall a small mob of kangaroos was sighted to the northward, and that led the pack to head northward, a little westerly, from the river bank that night. End of chapter 30.